0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Today's podcast is a gut-wrenching story where sport and tragedy collide to not only change lives, but an entire sport as well. You'll want to stick around for the Emile Griffith and Benny Paret story. What is the hardest thing you have ever attempted physically? Maybe it's running a marathon. 24 miles is a long distance to cover. Or maybe you spent the entire day on a grade 4 climb, slogging up the side of some mountain. Maybe it's just simply getting up every day and going to a job that you simply don't like. Now for me, I have taken on a lot of physical challenges. That's just the way that I am wired. For example, I enlisted in the U.S. Army and also would later earn a commission as an officer. So I went to boot camp, attended the officer basic courses, and the various schools that are associated with one's military career. For me, these were all physical challenges that I accepted and I met head on. But perhaps the most physical draining of all the challenges I faced was when I was about 12 years old and I agreed to step into a boxing ring with a much older kid who outweighed me by about 50 to 60 pounds and had at least 4 inches on me in height. What I learned that day was boxing is arguably the most difficult of all sports. It requires immense stamina, finesse, strength, power, and most of all, the ability to take a punch. That day, I discovered a few facts about myself. For one, you have to be able to take a punch. Getting hit squarely in the nose makes you lose the ability to control the rest of your bodily functions. I was pummeled that day, beaten so badly that I did not enter a boxing ring for at least 15 years. You didn't hear me. At least 15 years. I just simply wouldn't go near the sport. And I don't mean to make light of this. The story I am about to tell is one of the most heartbreaking and gut-wrenching stories that you will ever hear. But for me that day, in that 5 by 6 meter ring, I learned a valuable lesson about how boxing can be and is truly a man's and a woman's sport, and not for the faint of heart. But my fight was a kid's fight. A very short battle of about 3 rounds where the only thing that I lost that day was my pride. But in the case of Emile Griffith and Benny Paret, what was lost on a fateful night in 1962 was more than pride. It was the loss of a young, gifted, and promising life. This is the story of Benny Paret and Emile Griffith. Boxing has always had its two sides. On the one hand, it's known for the technical skill required to master the sport. This is why boxing is often called the sweet science. And on the other hand, it's known for its absolute brutality. Think about it. What is more titillating than watching Mike Tyson take out his opponent in the first round? It's a sport where men and women sometimes hope to pound each other in submission for fame and glory. In the case of Emile Griffith, he didn't just pound Benny Paret onto the canvas, he killed him. But what makes the Emile Griffith story so provocative? It wasn't just that Griffith killed Benny Paret in front of a live television audience, although you will soon hear there will be ramifications for that. But I believe that the fight was an example of how we humans, in our deeply flawed love of the unusual, is what we truly love about sports. How the forces of politics and culture intersect to make tragedy. So who were these two men? Bernardo, or Benny the Kid Paret, was born on March 14, 1937 in Cuba. He was born a number of years prior to General Batista becoming the de facto dictator of Cuba and the rise of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Paret won the World Welterweight Championship twice. His first welterweight title was won for the first time in 1960 by defeating Louis Frederico Thompson. His overall record was 35 wins, 10 knockouts, 12 losses, and 3 draws. Emile Alphonse Griffith was born on February 3, 1938 in the U.S. Virgin Islands. When he would finish his career, he would have earned the welterweight, junior middleweight, and middleweight championships. His record was 85 wins, 23 wins by knockout, and 24 losses. Many of those losses came at the end of his career, so certainly by every measurement, Emile Alphonse Griffith was an outstanding boxer. Griffith was voted in 1963 and 1964 as Fighter of the Year by Ring Magazine and the Boxing Writers Association of America. In 2002, he was listed number 33 on Ring Magazine's list of the 80 greatest fighters of the past 80 years. Griffith currently ranks number 20 in BoxRec's ranking of the greatest pound-for-pound boxers of all times. Emile and Benny met in the ring for the first time on April 1, 1961. Although nearly the same age, Griffith was an up-and-coming fighter looking to make a name for himself. He defeated Paret by knocking him out in the 13th round. 6 months later, in a rematch, Paret won on points by a narrow split decision. This then led to their fateful third rematch, which was scheduled for March 24, 1962. So what made this fight unlike any other? Manuel Velasquez began collecting data in the 1940s. And according to his data, between 1890 and 2011, an estimated 1,604 boxers have died as a direct result of injuries sustained in the ring. Why is Velasquez collecting this data? Velasquez isn't a boxer or a person who was remotely tied to boxing, but he had a friend named Pete Nebo who had died as a result of injuries suffered in the ring, and Velasquez spent years compiling newspaper clippings in an attempt to get the sport abolished. From reading the data, what I found is that between 1920 and 1950, these were the most extremely deadly, according to my calculations, and an estimated 736 boxers died during that time period as a result of boxing-related injuries. The Paret-Griffith fight happened in a decade where 117 fighters died directly related to boxing. Now, with the Velasquez data, all of the boxing deaths are cause for alarm. But boxing, as we all know, is an inherently dangerous sport. You get in the ring, you understand what's at stake, that you must protect yourself at all times. And from my own personal experiences, as I stated earlier in the show, that I found out a very valuable lesson in boxing, that it is an extremely dangerous and also an extremely exciting sport. Now, what adds to this story is the idea that while much of the pre-fight events are unknown, Paret seems to have developed a deep animosity towards Griffith. This, we are fairly certain, was due to the fact that Griffith had been known, or at least the rumors had been spread, that he had been frequenting homosexual bars or gay bars. Griffith, in his years following the fight, stated that he, in fact, did like both men and women. Nothing unusual about this today, but in the climate of the 1960s, with the end of the Second World War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War on the horizon, hyper-male masculinity was deeply rewarded. The Stonewall Rebellion didn't occur until June 1969. Our urge to recognize and reward male masculinity is probably nowhere else more evident than in the sweet science. Even in women's boxing, we desire our female champions not to necessarily look like men, but to dominate like men. Emile Griffith was, as ever, a talented boxer ever to come out of New York, but he was also a homosexual who also had the hobby as a hat designer. A hat-making gay man defies our notion and our expectation of manhood, and the price we all paid for our prejudices was the death of Paret. He paid for not only his sins, but for ours. It is customary before each fight, particularly those of significance, for fighters to attempt to gain a psychological edge over a fighter. Boxing, as I learned, and it's the same way I think with most sports, is just as much a psychological contest as it is a physical one. And prior to the fight, Paret engaged in his own psychological warfare by repeatedly publicly taunting Griffith with a familiar and derogatory Spanish phrase of maricón. Paret repeatedly directed the term, even in Griffith's presence. Eyewitnesses recall that at the weigh-in, Paret made at least one derogatory slur and even touched Griffith's buttocks. Emile stated to his manager that if Paret said anything derogatory before the fight, he was going to knock Paret out. His manager urged him to save it for the ring, and Griffith took that advice. Struggling to contain himself, at one point, Griffith became so irate he vehemently repeated that he was nobody's maricón. Paret yelled, "Hey, maricón, I'm going to get you and your husband." What was clearly on display here was Paret's hyper-Afro-Latin masculinity. What took place on that night in 1962 was on display for the entire television world to see. At the sound of the bell, the fight took its usual twists and turns and even saw Paret knock Griffith to the canvas. That was in the 6th round. But until the incident, the fight was largely anticlimactic until the 12th round. Within 2 minutes of the 12th round, Griffith began to unleash a blistering barrage of punches that soon bludgeoned Paret, who had retreated to the ropes in despair. It was if a sleeping monster had been unleashed within Griffith, or still better, nobody's maricón had been awakened. Over the years, countless writers and pundits have noted the number of clean head-shattering solid punches that had landed on Paret's head, and they stated that they amounted to somewhere between 17 to 25 in 5 seconds. It was as violent of a beating ever witnessed in professional boxing. In short, it was a beatdown. Paret's listless body slowly slumping to the canvas, and he never regained consciousness. Outside the boxing arena, this might have been a crime. All one can think is whether Griffith's barrage was payback for Paret's incessant verbal abuse, or was it a masterful, pugilistic bludgeoning by a talented and hungry fighter yearning to vindicate his manhood, or simply one gifted fighter outboxing another? You be the judge. The story of Emile Griffith makes ruin of the fine line between homosexuality, eroticism, homophobia, and quite frankly, what life can be like when people in society don't quite know how to deal with a human being who doesn't feel, act, or love the way we want them to do. In the 1960s, it was still quite unacceptable to be gay, and in particular, a gay boxing champion of the world. Emile Griffith was haunted all the last days of his life by what transpired before and after he destroyed Paret. The televised fight so stunned the viewing audience that New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller created a 7-man commission to investigate the incident and the sport, and boxing would not appear back on television for decades. Paret remained in a coma and died on April 3, 1962. Paret's wife is still haunted by that fateful night. The Paret son and Griffith managed to reconcile after many years. Griffith died on July 23, 2013 from complications from dementia, arguably and possibly from so many blows to the head. If you are interested in the full story of Emile Griffith, there is a fascinating documentary, Ring of Fire, the Emile Griffith story, which was produced and directed by Dan Cloris and Ron Berger in 2005. It is worth an hour of your time to watch a fascinating story about sport and tragedy merging. So that's all we have for today. And thank you for listening to another episode of The People's Historian.